afternoon. I'm Tanika Chapman-Mills, Adult Services Librarian and Department Manager at the Detroit Public Library. My colleague, Christine Peel, is working behind the scenes with me today. Welcome to the Detroit Public Library Author Series with the co-authors of Say Their Names, How Black Lives Came to Matter in America. Curtis Bunn is a best-selling author and award-winning journalist at NBC News Black. Michael Cottman is the program editor for the NBC Universal News Group Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion team. Patrice Gaines is the author of a memoir and self-help book and former reporter at the Washington Post. Nick Charles is the managing director of Word in Black and spokesperson for the Save the Journalism Project. And Keith Harriston is a professional lecturer in journalism at George Washington University. Now I'll turn the program over to the moderator, Mr. Michael Cottman.
Thank you, Tanika. And thank you all for joining this afternoon. We appreciate you being here. We're excited about this opportunity to talk about the story of Say Their Names, How Black Lives Came to Matter in America. And as you know, every book has a backstory. Our backstory is this: after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, a number of other African-American men and women who died senselessly and needlessly, I thought that it was necessary, and especially during this time, I should say, of the so-called racial reckoning era, I thought it was important to kind of examine the impact of white supremacy on Black folks, take a deep dive into systemic racism, the Black Lives Matter movement, racial inequality in America right now. So I scribbled some thoughts and some notes on a crumpled napkin, and I reached out to these four deeply insightful journalists who you will hear from this afternoon: Patrice, Curtis, Nick, Keith, and we talked about how they could offer tremendous offering of analysis about race in America today. And each of these authors didn't bat an eye, folks. I mean, they took up the mantle immediately, accepted this challenge to write about multiple issues involving race in America in a way that we can all speak in one voice. And I got to tell you, it's a difficult thing to do, and to do it during a pandemic. So we are offering you today an opportunity to hear how we wrote the book, to hear the various sections from the authors, and can talk about each of the sections they wrote eloquently. But this is a book ultimately that we feel is uplifting, a book that's inspirational, and a book that's empowering. Before I'm going to start with Keith, but before I do, I just want to tell you all that I'm proud that I grew up in Detroit, grew up on Detroit's East Side, right next door to the children of Levi Stubbs, the late lead singer of the Four Tops. And I have many fond memories of Detroit, and challenging ones. In the 1970s, my dad would talk to me about driving while Black back then. Curtis Bunn knows a lot about that. He and I have had a lot of conversations about this, and you'll hear from Curtis. And he talked to me about making sure that you show your hands if you ever get pulled over by police, and he hoped I didn't. Well, when I was 17, I did, like many young Black men like me. Got pulled over, humiliating situation, and scary, but I was lucky. You know, I drove away. A lot of us aren't so lucky. The advice that my dad gave me years later, still important today. So just yesterday, in fact, Minnesota police officer Kim Potter, as you know, was sentenced to 2 years in jail for killing Dante Wright during a traffic stop. Potter had maintained that she mistakenly shot him with her gun. She thought she was drawing a taser. Keith Harriston has written extensively about race and policing over the years. And I want to start with Keith because he wrote a powerful section for Say Their Names about race and policing. And Keith, let's start. I just want to ask you, why are Black folks, still facing these deadly force tactics from police? And what did your reporting reveal in your section?
Well, first, let me just say I'm glad and happy and thankful to be here as guests for the Detroit Public Library. So why are we still subject to over-policing? Well, history is really important. That's one of the things I liked about this project a lot, and I think we all sort of have the same feeling, is that it really presented an opportunity to look at things in a historical context in ways that journalists don't always get a chance to do when they're doing daily journalism. And sort of the the foundation for policing in this country started in the 1700s in South Carolina with groups that were named slave patrols. And those slave patrols were created by slave owners who lived in fear in most areas because they were like severely outnumbered by the enslaved. So they came up with slave patrols whose job was to essentially keep the enslaved people in check. And, you know, a lot of people have this mistaken notion that, you know, that during enslavement that the enslaved were essentially on plantations, didn't leave plantations. Well, that's not really how things work. There was some movement around. And slave patrols would stop if they saw, you know, a Black person walking around off of a plantation. They'd, you know, their job was to stop, ask, what's going on? Where are you going? Who owns you? And so if you had, you know, if there was a group of Black people, they would break up that group because they didn't want talking to each other because, again, they feared insurrection. If we bring that, you know, there's some time in between that Patrice will talk about, and you'll see how things are connected. But a lot of what they did, all of us, Michael, you mentioned how you were stopped at 17 years old. And I'm sure any Black male, some Black females, this scenario will sound familiar. You're standing, like walking down the street with a group of your friends, usually in the summertime. Police car will pull up and say, "What are y'all doing? You know, what are you doing? Go home, or you can't stand here, get off the corner," that kind of thing. Very similar to what slave patrols did. Another example that from, you know, much more recent history is in New York with the stop and frisk rules that the then Mayor Rudy Giuliani impacted, which essentially told law enforcement officers, you see a young Black male or a young Latino, stop them and frisk them, check them, see if they have weapons on them. You know, it was later ruled to be unconstitutional, but nevertheless, those kinds of things have held fast. And, you know, and ironically, in a lot of, especially in urban areas where we now have Black elected officials and have for decades, even though that's now starting to change again as things go in cycles. But, you know, on paper, police departments work for the executive in a jurisdiction, whether that be like a county executive or a mayor. And you would think that they should be able to change things, the way people, you know, police act in Black neighborhoods. Just hasn't happened for a lot of reasons. One is because a lot of people in Black neighborhoods, for instance, they, you know, as bad as police are, they'd rather have some kind of policing than no kind of policing. And you know, one of the things that I found interesting was, so we're writing and working on this in the summer of 2020. There was a shooting. There was a shooting. As a matter of fact, one of the things I discovered, a Black person is killed by law enforcement in this country like once every 38 hours in 2020. It hasn't really changed. In fact, you know, things aren't really getting better in spite of some of the reforms that have happened. In 2021, this is like the 6th consecutive year that the number of Black people and people overall being shot and killed by law enforcement has gone up. But that summer there was more than one, but there was this one example of a shooting in the Congress Heights neighborhood of Southeast Washington, D.C. There's a group of Black young guys, like from 18 to their early 20s, who were sitting in a car, all had like handguns, and they had it on social media. Somebody reported it, you know, about 3 or 4 or 5 police cars came up on them, speeding, lights blaring and all of that. And the kids got out of the car and started running. One kid was running toward a police officer, reached behind him, grabbed a gun from his waistband that was in the small of his back and tried to toss it. However, as he's pulling it out to toss it, you know, police officer sees a kid with a gun going like this, shot and killed him. The first day that happened, there were like hundreds, like, you know, 500-600 people protesting at the local police station. There was a racial mix. And because it was like, you know, about 15 to 20 minutes from my house, I went to observe. It was very mixed. In fact, there were more Black people. The second day, the police released videotape of that incident and showed the kid with the gun in the air that it did look like he was pointing at someone. That night at that police station, there were still about 300 or 400 people protesting. Overwhelming majority of them were white people. Black people were like, well, you know, you can't pull a gun on a cop and expect to live. And part of that is the conditioning that we're living with. And surprisingly, there were even community activists, people who people follow, and I think that had a lot to do with it, who pointed that out and said, look at the video, you can't do that. You know, everybody's sorry the kid died, you know, but you can't pull a gun out on a cop like that and expect to walk away, especially if you're young and Black and male. So, I mean, those are some of the reasons that we're still in this situation in our communities in particular. And one of the police reform workers who's done a lot, especially in Columbia, we talked about that case, and she, you know, and I said, well, you know, it seems to me that maybe this defund police movement and reform is a little bit out ahead of where DC residents are, especially Black DC residents. She says, well, see, but people have to understand, if that incident had happened in a majority white neighborhood, would police have responded the way they did? Or would it have been one or two cars that would have come up without the lights on, pulled up, talked to the kids, taken them home? Would they have been, you know, would they have, their response have been as aggressive? And the aggressive policing is what forced those kids to jump out of the car and run. So, I mean, those are kind of things that people have to think about. And I'll just add one more thing about this, about why are we still here? Back in this is going to go back not to the 1700s, but it still goes back about 3 decades. The mayor of Washington, D.C. in the early 90s was Sharon Pratt Kelly. She was the first native D.C. and the first woman, Black woman, to be elected mayor of D.C. She's running for re-election. And she had decided she was going to change things. Her campaign was, the focus of her campaign was, we're going to stop locking up so many Black people. We're just locking up too many people, and that's not really accomplishing anything. And I'm tired of us, these are her words, I'm tired of us, you know, doing this aggressive, she called it bully policing. She said, we're just going to stop doing that. And her whole campaign was built around that thing, those things, and she lost. So there's that.
Keith, I want to thank you for that. I do want to get one question in too for you to talk about the culture of policing. And I remember years ago, I covered something at a police precinct called the cultural sensitivity training. And I remember the pushback, right, from white police officers who did not want to participate. It was mandatory, so they had to, but I heard the rumblings. They don't want to be there. How do we change the culture? And what about these cultural sensitivity trainings? Are these just, you know, toothless tigers?
Well, you know, and a thing that we all have to remember, because all of us here on this panel, we all have essentially lived in, grew up in areas that had lots of Black people around. And our police agencies, for the most part, you know, they have hired people, some local people, but people from within an area that have some interactions with Black people. Most police departments in this country, as I interviewed a Black police chief from a small city in Mississippi, he explained to me, he said, most agencies in this country hire people who have never had any interactions with people of color ever. And so their visions of us are what they get through the media and what they get through pop culture. And so what do they see? He says, that's why for many of them, they see us as thugs, because that's all they know about us. And as far as that training, you get those in some cities, and now because of the the Summer of Reckoning, you get it more. But basically, you don't get a whole lot of that training. I mean, a police academy might last for anywhere from 4 to 6 months, and these things are broken down into segments. And you just don't. They don't spend. I mean, how can you change somebody's mindset? You know, who's 20, early to mid 20s, never had any exposure to Black people. 1 4-hour session is just not going to do it.
Also, Keith, I'll interject on that. Excuse me. And it's really great to be here. Really appreciate Ms. Chapman Mills for supporting this book and the work that we've done. But the other part of these officers don't live in the neighborhoods they patrol. So often they're driving 35, 40 minutes away, up to an hour away, to their white neighborhoods that foster the same racial tropes, racial ideas, stereotypes about us. And then they come into our neighborhoods with those attitudes, which invoke fear in them. That's why they're so aggressive. That's why they're quick to shoot us, because they have these mentalities that are antiquated, but pervasive in law enforcement, not only there, but the medical field and all other fields that we'll get into, I'm sure.
Thanks, Curtis. Good points. Patrice, you're an expert on mass incarceration among Black folks, and you write with authority and with passion about your section about how Black folks are treated in the prison system and systemic racism. How does systemic racism fit in to your section when you talk about mass incarceration in Black folks? And tell us a little bit about what your research revealed.
Sure. Well, the system was built on racism because the system grew out of slavery. Just as Keith talked about policing. So what we had was, you know, in the South, there was slavery, and in the North, which we often consider progressive because we hear about abolition movements in the North, but the North is actually where prisons started. They started in Philadelphia in 1790. And the initial thought was that people who committed crimes needed a place to go where they would meditate and think about the wrong they have done. But after the Emancipation Proclamation, after Blacks were freed in the South and Blacks began to move north, that kind of thinking about what prisons were for began to change. So what we had was, by that time, Black people began to be over-policed as well as over-incarcerated from the very beginning, because they were still seen as less than, their crimes were seen as worse. There was a series of fires, in fact, in the 1800s in Pennsylvania. And the judge, I found in research, said that those were crimes that were committed, you know, by former slaves. White people would not commit fire, you know, would not start fires. So there were these beliefs, we could see these stereotypes already beginning. In the South, meanwhile, the farmers or plantation owners, slave owners who had now lost their free labor, had to figure out a way to get that labor back. And so what they did was they came up with these Black codes that became Jim Crow laws. So you had Black people begin to be arrested for things like vagrancy, walking on the wrong side of the street, walking at night, just, you know, those kind of ridiculous charges, and that allowed them to just throw people into prison. And then once they could throw them into prison, they began using them to do the work. They started convict leasing. Well, convict leasing has started in the North some, but in the North, you could basically rent a person. You know, you would pay and you would use them for the day and you would return them back to the prison. But in the South, you pretty much bought this person. You paid for them and you took care of them. And we know that that meant you basically did not take care of them. You worked them to death. So we had Black people who were dying working in mines, working in sugarcane fields, because they gave them the hardest labor, the most dangerous labor. And even today, they're still discovering these mass graves where people, including some children, were just absolutely worked to death. And so this has continued. I wanted to say a little bit about Michigan as well. We are a country that, you know, continues to over-incarcerate people, and particularly Black people. Black people in this country make up a little over 13% of the population, but we make up about a third of the more than 2 million people who are incarcerated. Now, in Michigan, the rate of incarceration is 554 people per 100,000, which in the US is 664 per 100,000. But both of these figures are more than most countries even incarcerate. Like if you were to compare that to Norway, you would have 54 people per 100,000, and yet they have a lower crime rate. Also in Michigan, while Blacks make up 49% of the people who are incarcerated, they only make up 13%, well, almost 14% of the population. White people, on the other hand, make up 14% of the incarcerated and almost 80% of the population. But, you know, Michigan is not different than any other state. And then I just wanted to mention a case from Detroit that I've been involved in for, I guess, about 3 decades now almost. But I went to speak at a prison in Connecticut, and there was a woman there named Michelle West. She had reached out to me when she knew that she was that I was coming. Michelle grew up in Detroit and was arrested in Detroit, and her case represents a trend that we see among women who date drug dealers, and the women themselves end up being charged and end up doing a lot of time. In Michelle's case, she was charged because the guy she dated was a drug dealer. It seems that he put a hit on somebody who had stolen from him, and the person who committed the crime took a plea deal, and in doing that, and had to offer up information, said that Michelle was involved in the murder. So Michelle, who had never, did not have a record, this was her first offense. She was a single mom, was incarcerated, and that was in 1993. She received 2 life sentences plus 50 years, which is what, other countries don't do such a thing. But she remains in prison. She's been there 29 years. She has been in many documentaries. People have been fighting to get her free. Anybody can just Google Michelle West, particularly if you go to a site called Can Do, which is an organization that's been responsible for getting some people out recently because Kim Kardashian got involved. Michelle was like the second person on the list. They didn't get down to her yet, but there are a lot of people trying to work to get her free.
Patrice, thank you for that. And what I'd also like you to speak to, if you will, the personal aspect of your section. This story for you, right, is personal. Could you share with our audience?
Oh yeah, no problem. Because I've written about that. I wrote a memoir called Laughing in the Dark about my life. So when I was 21 and I was living in Charlotte, North Carolina, which I live right outside of Charlotte now, I was arrested for possession of heroin, possession with intent to distribute, and possession of a needle and syringe. I was a heroin user, but the police tried to say that I was a drug dealer because I had 2 friends visiting me, 2 men from Washington, D.C. And so when you have also experienced seeing police try to build a case against you and seeing people lie, you know what is possible, what this system can do to a person. I was fortunate coming from a middle-class background that my parents could afford a good lawyer for me. And I was fortunate that I did my crime before mandatory sentencing. So I ended up with 5 years of probation. However, I became a convicted felon. I thought I was getting off easy. Well, not easy, but I thought, thank goodness, didn't have to go to prison. I was in jail for part of a summer. But what you find out once you're labeled a convicted felon, it remains with you forever and ever and ever. The last time I was fired from a job because of my record, I was 60 years old. So that had been many years after my crime, but it just goes to show you this is the system that we have built.
Yeah. Thank you, Patrice. You're a blessing. Curtis, I want to spend some time taking a deep dive into a couple of your sections. Curtis wrote eloquently and again with authority, the way everyone did, about the COVID-19 and about the impact that the pandemic had on Black folks, and disproportionately so. And I want Curtis, I want you to talk about this in the context also of you are writing about a pandemic and its impact on Black folks while in a pandemic. So, right, and that's unique. You know, we haven't been in a situation like that before. And so tell us about that, please.
Yeah, it was a relatively surreal experience. Because not only was I writing about it, but I was researching about past medical history, public health history of Black people in America, and learning so much. Also trying to stay safe by staying home or wearing my mask and socially distancing, and then continually to learn from Dr. Fauci and the CDC and others about what this virus really was. We were in the middle of it, and it was continuing, the information was continuing to change, continuing to grow. So it made it challenging, but it also made it interesting. One of the things I always talk about when we get an opportunity to talk about the book, and I talk about the pandemic, is that it's very important to understand, I think, to Black people to understand that because we're Black, simply because we're Black isn't a reason that we were hit harder, devastated more than any other race. And if you listen to the experts, you could come away with that because it's a much more context to it. And I talked to many psychologists, epidemiologists, physicians, researchers who were very disappointed, all of them Black, very disappointed in some of the messaging from the so-called experts who were on television talking about why Black people were impacted so severely. They didn't put in, many of them, most of them didn't put in the proper context of Black people have these underlying conditions that were talked about, diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, because of the history of public health racism in America, the environmental racism, the food deserts, the wealth gap. All of these contributed to the fact that Black people didn't, or by and large, didn't have access to healthier foods. So in many neighborhoods, grocery stores with fresh fruits and vegetables aren't available. But there's a McDonald's, there's a Wendy's, there's a Burger King, all of these fast food places that are really not healthy, provide healthy options. So when you are continually hammering home this message that Black people are severely impacted, but you're not telling why, it creates a false narrative. And we've been through so much of that false narrative through the Trump's presidency. And so it was disappointing to have public health experts talk about this, but not put it in its proper context. Mm-hmm. Obviously, I wrote about in the section about a guy's personal experience, how devastating it was to him. He was able to survive, but he looked at his life differently after surviving. But he had harrowing moments where he really was getting his affairs in order because he did not think he was going to get out of it. Mm-hmm. But what happened to Black people during the pandemic has happened to us throughout the history of this country. Keith was talking about the systems being not working. They weren't intended to work. And same with they weren't intended to help us. It's the same with the public health system. Do you know that 50% of white doctors who are coming out of medical school believe that Black people's skin is thicker, that we are impervious to pain more so than they are. And that impacts how we're treated in hospitals. So prominent medical publications came out with studies that indicated we receive less pain medication when required because of these ridiculous ideas that supposedly smart people, doctors, believe. So there's a doctor that I interviewed out of Boston named Rachel Hardeman, a sensational doctor who in 9 years ago, she wrote an article in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is the preeminent medical publication, that racism is a public health crisis. And nobody had done that before. She put it all on display for everyone. And she challenged anyone to dispute it among the doctors, and nobody really could, because they were aware of their own biases. And they were also aware of past medical malfeasance against Black people that have existed, and it contributes to our lack of wanting to participate in public trials, hesitancy with the vaccine, hesitancy with anything that requires us to trust them, because so many documented cases of malfeasance have been, people are aware of. So, it's a troubling time because the system isn't set up, and it's not going to change until the systems are broken down, and the systems are set up to marginalize us, to make sure that we're under cared for. Just speaking specifically to the medical field, but we can talk about the same thing in pretty much every other area: public health, public school systems, employment. It's all set up the same, and until those systems or structures are destroyed and recreated, we're going to be talking about these kind of subjects and writing these kind of books for some time to come.
Yeah.
One thing I want to ask you, Curtis. This is Nick, Charles. Thank you guys so much for inviting us. Curtis, when racism works in our favor, and I say that in the opioid crisis, which was visited among white communities because doctors wouldn't prescribe opiates to Black folks. But then what they did is they changed the narrative around opiates as not being as, and making it seem as a disease, and the people who were using them were victims, as opposed to in earlier times when we were caught using drugs, it wasn't about it being a disease or that we were victims, we were lawless. And I'm wondering how that continues in different ways. You see how, yes, the opioid crisis hits the country, and all of a sudden the narrative changes, the media changes how they cover it, because it's not us being affected primarily. And the reason we're not being affected is because we're not being prescribed opioids, even if we need them.
Indeed. I grew up in Washington, D.C. I know what that crack epidemic was like. It hit my family. And all the media reports were the war on drugs, and it wasn't considered a disease. It wasn't considered anything but, bad behavior by bad people, essentially. And Nick, you laid it out perfectly. I don't know if I can add any more, but the opioid crisis is looked at so much differently because it's impacting more white people in more white communities. And so it can't be that they are bad people made bad decisions. It has to be something wrong with the system that made this happen to them. It has to be a disease. It has to be something other than the fact that, they're drug addicts. They don't want to say that. It's very disheartening. During COVID, this is sort of a segue to one other thing I wanted to talk about. But during COVID, there was a doctor who was in a hospital in Indiana with COVID, struggling, but she could tell her doctor, her white doctor, all her symptoms, and even advise him on how to treat her. He didn't believe her. She said she was struggling with her breathing. He said, "No, you're not." She's like, "I am." So until she went on Facebook Live and reported how she was being treated as a Black woman and a Black doctor in this hospital by her white doctors, nothing happened. They eventually changed her to another hospital, but she ended up dying. Now, did she die because was death inevitable? Nobody knows. But what we do know is that they mistreated her. They undertreated her simply because she was Black. They did not believe that her issues were real. That kind of stuff is unacceptable. But they look at another patient who doesn't have the expertise that she does, a white patient, and says she needs pain medicine, she can't breathe, and she gets the proper treatment. These aren't parallel scenarios when we talk about the opioid crisis and the crack epidemic, but it just goes to show you that in every area around drugs, around treatment, there's this different perception when it comes to us. And it speaks to the need for more medical Black doctors. There are far more Black people in need of doctors, so many Black people who can't get a Black doctor, but Black doctors are obviously far more sensitive to our needs than white doctors. This isn't just anecdotal. These are what studies from prominent publications indicate.
Thank you, Curtis. Nick, I want to turn to you. And right before I do that, I just want to remind the audience, if you have questions for anybody on our panel, put your questions into the chat, and we'll be glad to answer them at the conclusion of our discussion. Happy to do it. So please ask us questions. Nick, I want to turn to you because for our audience, Nick Charles wrote a fresh, thought-provoking section about the role of the Black church. And so I want Nick to talk a little bit about this because he focused on this from a unique perspective, number one, and talk a little bit about the Black church, the role, especially in this era of racial reckoning and as it relates to the Black Lives Matter movement.
Thank you so much, Michael. You know, I looked at the Black church, and like one of the things that that's a theme in our book is systems, you know, systemic racism, institutions that perpetuate bias, at the church as an institution, and the church as a repository of systems that in some respect hinder us, or have hindered Black folks. Remember, Black people are allowed to gather and worship because those who brought Africans to the shores, they, after a while, used the idea of saving souls. You were saving these people who were godless. And that's why they were inferior than white people were. They are built to work as slaves, but they were allowed to gather to learn Christianity and to practice whatever faith the slave masters had, because it was about salvation. You could get your salvation in the next life, because in this life, your lot was being a slave. Over the years, the Black church has moved and from salvation to liberation. Not always at once, but it took some time. And I think a lot of time we kind of, those transitions, particularly in the 50s and 60s with Dr. Martin Luther King and the movement for civil rights, which was not church-based, but was led by a man of God. People forget that a lot of denominations and preachers were not supportive of Dr. King's movement. They thought it was upsetting the apple cart, that he was a troublemaker. And so it took a while for that institution, the church, to come around. A lot of the things that the white church have been copied by the Black church. White churches are patriarchal, Black churches are patriarchal. White churches are not overly friendly and welcoming to queer people, neither is the Black church. And one thing that the Black Lives Matter movement has exposed is just how deeply some of these systemic things that exist in the church are not always compatible with liberation, not always. So the Black Lives Matter movement was founded by 3 young women, young Black women, 2 of whom who are queer. And while their mission may be lauded by the church, they themselves are who they are. They couldn't bring their full selves to the church. And so people in the church, the traditional church, whether it's AME, Baptist, whatever denomination, don't seem to understand or don't seem to want to accept that these folks have a different way of living. They are part of God's children, but they're also not beholden to the church. They see the patriarchy in the church. One of the things that I learned the most about in my research in my chapter was just how many women are trying to be ministers, and the fact that the resistance they face, not only when they're in seminary, but when they get out, they can't find a pulpit, and then congregations themselves, which in the main are mostly women, don't accept them, because we've been so conditioned to have the man at the forefront, the head, that they find most resistance within their congregations from the female congregants. And so you have this Black Lives Matter movement, which is not how leadership has always been defined. You have the head, it's usually a man. Here you have women, you hear organization that's spread out, it's not concentrated. So if you cut off one head here, you're not going to kill the Black Lives Matter movement. You know, people could argue all day whether or not the civil rights movement stalled because Martin Luther King got shot. And some of that may be true, because all of a sudden you didn't have the leader. You had other folks, there were people around, but you didn't have that one giant outsized personality leading the quest for civil rights. Black Lives Matter movement is diffuse. It's a global organization in terms of its mission and its reach. I should think it's probably the second largest global movement after climate, climate justice. So in the chapter I'm looking at how the church, all the good things it has done, how in some respects it has gone on the sidelines and not been as forceful as it could have been. Not to say that they don't still protest, that they don't do good deeds, they still feed the hungry, they still try to find housing for the homeless or the unhoused. But in the quest for civil rights, social justice, the church, I think, has been in retreat. And one of the things, when you look at it as an institution, sorry, there's a weather warning here in New York. One of the things about the church is that as an institution, the first thing rules of institutions is to survive. And the church at times is more concerned with survival than it is with progress and what you may have to do to get that progress. That doesn't say that individual congregants don't support Black Lives Matter, who may be members of Black Lives Matter themselves, but not mutually exclusive. But it has to be recognized, and I think the church can do more. One of the ministers in the book says, if the church doesn't change, it'll die. And I believe as we look and we see that less and less folks identify as practicing Christians, less and less people go to, I don't know how many people still go to church, less and less folks are going to church on a regular basis. Something about the message is not getting through. And if the institution decides to stand pat, they will die.
You mentioned, I definitely want to ask you this question. You mentioned the word retreat, which I thought was a concerning characterization, and it's an important one that you highlighted. How do you reverse that? The Black church is retreating. How do you reverse that trend?
When I say, the Black church, as in all churches, the reality is we see the growth of the Black church is about survival. It's about keeping the coffins filled, keeping the minister in the lifestyle he and his family is accustomed to. We have different strains in the gospel of prosperity, the personal responsibility crowd, who don't look at institutions and systems in the same way and break them down like we have in the book. People talk about, Curtis just talked about the Black doctor who couldn't get her white doctor to understand her pain. That's not just an individual evil guy, that's a system, because he was taught that. And you don't need, sometimes you don't need people to do anything except what they've been taught or what they know. No one all of a sudden pivots and becomes this monster. It's the systems itself that, as long as it's perpetuated. And that's where we talk about how do you break the church to understand, to accept female clergy, to accept LGBTQ folks who are no less faithful. There's anybody to say that they are any less faithful than straight folks, but the church itself, and this is where it may go to theology, back to theology and scripture. So when it's in the Bible, there's a lot of stuff in the Bible. It's not, Black folks being inferior. Racists love to use the story of Ham. So the reality is, you have to have a more open understanding of that you need everyone in the community to save the community. You need everyone in the community to uplift the community. The church cannot do what it did during the HIV and AIDS crisis, which is like, oh, love the sinner, but hate the sin kind of thing. No, AIDS wasn't sin; it was a disease. When you cast it in those moral terms, they cast us as bad people because we did drugs, as opposed to white folks being victims when they became drug users. Those are the kinds of ways that African Americans and other people of color have always been repressed. And we do it to ourselves. If you put a system in place, you don't need someone to oversee that system, because the people who are being oppressed by that system will oppress themselves. We as a group, Black people are no less homophobic than anybody, but no more. We are a group of no less patriarchal, but we're no more. We have to look at and examine these things, that those things don't work if you want to be successful and you're interested in progress, if you're really interested in liberation.
Nick, always insightful. Thank you. I want to turn to Curtis to revisit something, and I think this is important. We start our book with a section that Curtis wrote called, appropriately, Why Black Lives Matter, right? Curtis, you wrote, it has awakened anew the power that resides within Black people. Talk to our audience a little bit about why we decided to open with your section about Black Lives Matter.
Well, I think the movement was so strong. I don't think anybody in the world has not used that expression, whether in a positive or negative way. It's not just an American movement, it was an international movement. And it was really at the core of the book. So it made sense to start there. And it made sense to look at the power of the people, the determination of the young women who started this organization and the impact that it made. So I think it was somewhat controversial to some people. I know when we had our initial launch event, a woman asked, well, the second part of the book is called How Black Lives Came to Matter in America. Do Black lives really even matter? Because so much stuff is continuing to happen. And I thought that was a very legitimate question. And I think we all questioned the title of the book. We struggled with it in the beginning because it doesn't literally mean how Black lives came to matter in America, because I think we all will say there are moments in every day or hours or probably maybe the entire day we feel like we still don't matter. When you look at the political construct, you look at the systemic and structural racism that continues to exist in 2022. I think we also thought coming out of 2020, when the book came out last year, October, we thought that we'd be in a different place as it related to the pandemic. We thought that all the movement, all the commitments and the awareness would impact some change, some visible change. And maybe there has been some, but the second half of the title of the book wasn't really a literal proclamation. It was that the Black Lives Matter movement was so strong, now you have to pay attention to us. So now maybe we matter, to where you have all these companies projecting all of these resources to social justice programs, to HBCUs, to the medical field. So maybe now we matter enough for them to care, and some change can happen. But it certainly didn't mean that we matter so much so that we live on or exist on an even playing field, because it's far from that.
Right. Thank you, Curtis. I'm going to toss it to myself and just talk briefly about my section about politics. And as someone who's covered the Obama administration and covered the first term, the only term of the late Mayor David Dinkins, who was the first African-American mayor of New York City, I thought it was important to write about politics. And my section is called the Black Political Lineage, from Adam Clayton Powell to Barack Obama. And so why politics? Black political empowerment, Black political engagement, I would argue is more important today than ever. So I wrote about Shirley Chisholm and Barbara Jordan and Carol Moseley Brown and Doug Wilder, all familiar names to you all. Kamala Harris, of course. And I thought about 4 questions that I've heard over the years. And so I started the section with these 4 questions. Questions from Black folks. Who will stand up for us? Who will champion our causes? Who will have our backs? Who will have the courage to speak our names? Why politics? Politics touches every single aspect of our lives. Doesn't matter whether it's a mayoral election, right? Or city council, state legislature, or US Congress. Politics dictates everything. It's the difference between adequate education for kids of color. It's the difference between whether our students, Black students, students of color can read books about slavery in our schools, the true history of slavery, or not. Politics can decide about toxic dumping, environmental racism, about toxic waste being dumped in communities of color and Black communities across this country, where thousands and thousands of young Black kids are suffering disproportionately from asthma and from other respiratory illnesses because of toxic dumping. Politics drives critical policies such as voting rights, as you know, healthcare, employment, even who sits on the Supreme Court, as President Biden today, right now, is going to decide whether we make history, right, by appointing the first Black woman to the Supreme Court. So I do believe that as we approach the 2022 midterm elections, Black political engagement, Black leadership, grooming the Black leaders of tomorrow is more important today than ever. Mark Muriel, the president of the National Urban League, wrote a powerful, powerful foreword for our book about social activism. And if you remember, just a couple of weeks ago, Mr. Muriel and several other civil rights leaders met with Roger Goodell, NFL commissioner, to talk about racial discrimination in the NFL, hiring in the NFL, and how the NFL treats Black coaches, Black men. And Muriel said about this particular meeting, in this case, the gravity of the situation is long past the crisis point. And so I think that sort of reflects where we are in America with racial reckoning, the stories that you're hearing from these authors today about this powerful issue about systemic racism and how we deal with it as African-American people. And Tanika, I think there are a couple of questions in the chat.
Yes, we have a comment and a few questions from Rochelle Riley.
Rochelle, hello, Rochelle. Good to hear from you.
Thank you for a powerful and necessary book. We must never stop teaching and speaking out. So now our best and brightest may never have a more receptive audience than the one that exists since the murder of George Floyd. To hear and understand what African Americans have been enduring and pointing to for more than a century. What needs to happen now for America to move from finally seeing if those who are and doing something about it? Is it the responsibility of churches, of Greek organizations, of NAACP chapters nationwide, of everyone? And who's going to tell white people? And is it the freedom we seek possible, or is the freedom we seek possible without white America supporting it?
Well,
she laid a lot.
Rochelle brings it.
you know what, I would say,
start unpacking that, Keith?
Yeah, I'll start. I'll try to keep it very brief. I think all those organizations you mentioned are necessary because the problem is so massive that we can't get anything done without all of them, without some much more progressive left-wing organizations, without white people. I mean, a clear example is, most political analysts say, well, Black people are responsible for Biden being in the White House. Well, and the result is what? What legislation has been passed specifically for us? The one that was the big one, police reform, voter suppression. Where have they gone? Nowhere. So I think, it's going to take them, just like it always has. It wasn't in the 60s during the modern civil rights era. It wasn't just the SCLC marching. There were other much more progressive groups that helped to pressure the system to listen to the more centric systems. But I do think we got to figure out a way to, one, get even more involved, especially in voting. And that we really need to start thinking about whether we want to continue to hand our community's vote over to candidates who aren't delivering after we give them those votes. Other groups tend to sort of make their deals ahead of time. We give our votes and then say, okay, we're hoping that this is going to happen. Well,
Yeah, I'll add to your point, Michael. The vote obviously is critical. Obviously, I think we've all heard a lot more about the midterm elections over the last several years, how important they are, because they are. But it's also about not just showing up, but knowing who you're voting for, doing your research. When we had the midterm elections here, my wife and I pulled out people's speeches, we read their policies, we understood who we were voting for on these local elections so that we can try to support somebody who's going to get in, who has ideals about fairness and changing some of the systems in place that are holding us, that are against us. So it's not just about voting and going to vote to show up. It's great. And it's obviously great that we got rid of that president, the previous president. And it's great what we did here in Georgia. I'm in Atlanta, and we turned Georgia blue. That was centralized voting in Metro Atlanta, some in Savannah, some in Macon, but Atlanta, that one small pocket, was so blue and people came out that it made a real difference. And I think the feeling that your vote doesn't matter has to stop. I think after 2016, we should all feel like we've got to do better, because we suffered 4 years that we didn't have to suffer through, because certain groups of people, Black men, didn't go out and vote for one, and didn't want to vote for Hillary Clinton. Instead, either voted for Trump or didn't vote at all, at a scale that was influential in the outcome of that election. So it's really not just about voting, but it's also about understanding who you're voting for. Study these local level politicians so that you know that you're advocating for someone who's advocating for you.
I think, 2016 is a great example of how misogyny trumps racism, because men will vote for women.
Yeah.
So one of the largest, if not the largest, Western democracy that's never had a woman in charge. And that's a shame. We talk about change. The question is, with all the organizations that Rochelle mentioned, which are all important, necessary, vibrant, and have been able to carve out for African Americans slices of life that are important and relevant, is what kind of change do you want? Do you want change where you get a place, a seat at the table, and you're comfortable? Or are we looking to make transformational change on a societal level that moves society forward, where everyone can get healthcare, where kids can have access to real, good, honest education, where workers can get equity and pay equity, and society itself becomes more equitable? The question is, what kind of change are you seeking? If you're seeking very superficial change, then Joe Biden is your guy because the tenor has changed, the tone has changed. But to Curtis, the Keith's point, what else? If we're going to argue, and even Black folks, can't defund the police, when it's not about defunding the police, it's about transforming the way policing is done so it is not disproportionately harmful to Black people. And Black people have to understand that as well. And if you are going to be serious about those things, you have to agitate, demonstrate, and you have to vote for those things. Voting for somebody because you like the guy or he's a decent person or whatever, that can't work. You have to vote for policies. Policies are what affect your life. So to Curtis's point, when elections come around, look and see what policies are most important to you, your family, your community, your people, and work for those things.
Well, one point that you made, those were good points about voting, who we're going to vote for. I have become over the years more of a proponent for term limits, because in my estimation, the days of our congressional leaders sticking around for 40 years should be abolished, because we need fresh ideas, we need fresh people, we need an infusion of new and innovative ideas. And so sometimes when you're talking about who to vote for, some of these people have been around so long, they're archaic. And so that's why I am, to Rochelle's question, I'm gratified in my research to find so many young people now who are becoming part of the political process, who are part of the political engagement, who are starting their own movements about politics. And that excites me.
I wanted to add, that is exactly what I wanted to say. And hi, Rochelle. But I wanted to say that I think all of us in all of our research found so many young people who are active and bringing new blood to all of these struggles or challenges. And I find great hope in that. I saw a local program here. I'm in South Carolina, and so we're jealous, Curtis, of you in Georgia. But anyway, in South Carolina, there was a program on recently because this weekend they're honoring a group of Black people. They were actually in Shelby, North Carolina, which is close to where I am. But I think they're probably in their 70s now. But when they were young, when they were in high school, they marched down to this local drugstore, just like, you know, in Greensboro and in many places that we'll never know. They marched down there because they were sick and tired of not being able just to sit down at the counter and to order. And they were just determined to do it. And they said as they marched, other people followed them. Some of those people, though, were protesting against them. Some of them were angry white people. People threw rocks at them. But they said that they remembered that they didn't care about the rocks, that they were not afraid. They were going to sit on those stools. And I think that, you know, the truth is when you're younger, you have a certain fearlessness that that you tend to not have as you get older. And they've inherited a different world, and really different because of the work that many of us have done. And so they want to take it even differently. And I remember this person, in one of these people who, like I said, they're in their 70s now, who had marched, and she said, we didn't want to be treated like our parents were treated. And I think that kind of feeling still exists, and I find great hope in that.
That's profound. Thank you.
Can I jump in just because Rochelle's question also addressed fraternities and sororities? As a proud member of Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, the first fraternity for Black men, the fraternity of Martin Luther King and Thurgood Marshall and Cab Calloway and Donny Hathaway and on and on and on. We do great service in the community, but I do think that fraternities and sororities have to become more political. They have to start helping communities identify these politicians that are working in our best interest and helping share that information. I think we're we have our programs that are about scholarship and getting kids to school and helping underserved communities, which is very effective and is great. But I think overall, we have to do a better job and start getting a little bit more politically involved. I was in DC when the Delta Sigma Theta had its 100th anniversary. I forgot, 2013 maybe. And they were 100,000 Deltas in DC. And I happened to be visiting that weekend. I love the Deltas. My wife was a Delta. I have many Delta friends. But it was the same night that George Zimmerman was acquitted of killing Trayvon Martin. And my reaction was that they should have taken those 100,000 Black women and marched down to the Capitol or somewhere in a show of force and protest. And instead they stuck with their same program. I think we have to be a little bit more on our feet and make adjustments based on what's happening in the moment and not have to sit down and think about it and panel discussion about it for months before we start reacting as well. Not just the Deltas, not just the Alphas, but everyone. That's not picking on the Deltas. I want to make that clear, but I'm just saying, I think that was an opportunity to really show a force to say, we're going to abandon our agenda for the morning and we're going to march to the Capitol in protest of this decision that all angered us and really was the impetus of the Black Lives Matter movement, or creation of the organization, I should say. Yeah,
that's a good point, Curtis. Thank you. Mm-hmm. And you'll be getting some calls from some Deltas, I'm sure.
Love y'all.
I want to get one.
Oh, go on, Keith.
Okay, I just one other thing on still sort of referring to going back to the question from Rochelle. is an example of how we need to sort of reach out even within our community, because it's not monolithic. We're like on a spectrum. When I was a reporter at the Washington Post, covering for about 1 year higher education, students at the University of the District of Columbia took over the university because they wanted some change. They were led by Mark Thompson, who's now an activist pastor in New York City. And part of their whole, how he was excellent at working the students up to get them all to follow him to get some change. One of the things, of course, they pointed a lot of enemies: board of trustees, news media, which of course I represented, like, the Washington Post. However, he was smart enough to know, he says, you know what, we're going to be in this building, we're sleeping, we're taking it over, we're not leaving until there's change. We have to make sure we have a reporter in here with us that we can trust, that will be able to write, that we're not in here tearing this building up. And so, there was pushback from some of the other students who said, why are we letting the Washington Post in here? He said, no, we need him in here to tell our story and to tell everybody else how we're treating, these buildings, that we're not in here tearing things up, that we're doing this, and this. And that was just sort of an example of a real life example of how you need to reach out. We need to reach out to each other in our community and strengthen the bonds, because it's a lot easier to get some change accomplished when you reach out to people beyond your immediate groups.
Thank you, Keith. We're about at time here. I just want to thank everybody for participating. I want to close out with giving each of our panel members an opportunity to answer this question. I want to just toss out to you guys. When our readers finish this book, cover to cover, right? What's the takeaway from this book for you guys? What do you want people to learn? What do you want them to think about? What do you want them to ponder?
Well, ladies first, if you want to go, Patrice, otherwise I'll go.
All right, well, I don't mind. One, I want them to see, I think it was Keith that mentioned how as reporters, we often do so many stories, we don't get to stand back and see how everything is connected. I'm hoping that what we have written will allow people to see that many of the things that are happening, well, it is deliberate, that there is a system that is in place that supports disparities between Blacks and whites, between whites and people of color, and that system continues, and that they can step back and really see where it started, and how it has continued. But as well, I don't want that to be so overwhelming that they feel that nothing can be done, because I think in every chapter there are also stories of hope. There are people who would not give up. There are people who are still fighting, and they will know some of those people, because those people, we don't get to hear their stories often. We get to hear the so-called leaders or the people maybe who are the loudest, but there are many people out there quietly working and fighting every day. So I do hope that they will also see the hope.
Thank you, Patrice. Curtis?
I think the book is a living document that will stand the test of time, that you'll be able to look back on 5 years from now, 15 years from now, and say, I lived through this period and I can relate to the stories about what happened in 2020 and early part of 2021. But also, I think the beauty of the book is that each chapter was put in its proper context, its historical context, which kind of showed us how we got to this moment. So it's very much a history lesson. I enjoyed the part of the book that was learning for me, which was more than 50% of it. It was some of what I learned was disheartening for sure, but it strengthened me. It gave me a much better context and standing into how we got to where we are. And it also scared me some, because it makes me realize how daunting it is to get beyond this point. But it was very encouraging that what we wrote about also impacted, or introduce readers to young future political leaders who have a commitment to making change, to being a part of this fight for a long time. Most of these people, at least 5 of them that I talked to, weren't even old enough to vote, but they're already committed to the cause. And that's very encouraging. So it makes me feel like this movement won't die anytime soon, because the young folks are coming up in the rear with a lot of enthusiasm and commitment. In the end, I hope that the readers get out of this that I have to do more. We all have to do more. The book illuminates the disproportionate elements of life that we face as Black people, and it's going to take all of us to get out of it. So we all make a commitment to do more, to help more, to educate people who around us who don't know, through this book, but also through other books and other elements that are happening right before us, so when we see on television, but really just being more involved, encouraging people to vote and being a part of the community, as opposed to saying, I got mine and I'm good. Then if you got that out of this book, then I think our mission has been accomplished.
Well said.
I want us to really, we pay a lot of lip service to how much we love Black women, how great Black women are. And yet we do so much to not empower them or to recognize their power. My friends and I always live by once very brief coda. The hierarchy of intelligent life on the planet is Black women and dolphins, and everybody else after that. And if we are always talking about how great Black women are, they are the foot soldiers in the movement, they are the power behind the throne and all this other stuff, no. They're the ones who will lead us out of this. Because until we start supporting them explicitly, not just implicitly or give it lip service, Black women are so strong. And because let's be honest, when we talk about who put Biden in the office, if you want to think that his candidacy was rejuvenated and saved in South Carolina, it was Black women. That's who voted for Biden. So recognizing that power, celebrating that power, using that power, and not being afraid of that power. I think there is a lot of folks out there, particularly men, of course, who are afraid of the true nature and power that women have. And so there has to be an understanding that going forward, to Curtis's point, in these young folks, it has to be an understanding of who our leadership could be and who our leadership is, and how do we celebrate and promote that leadership to bring about the kind of change that just doesn't affect us, because we all know when African Americans do stuff, particularly civil rights, or agitate for better conditions, it improves a lot of all Americans. It's not just, what people always think, well, you guys is marching for this. Well, what I'm marching for is what you should be marching. And I think once we, to Curtis's point, don't sit by passively, we can't afford to be passive. If anything from this book, you have to be, to use one of Keith's words, just a activist, because those who would retard our growth, who would stop progress, are very active. We need to be as active.
Keith, I'm going to give you the last word.
Okay. Oh boy. Okay. So here's what I, by the way, book, in case anybody can't see the cover behind me, here's the book. I think the thing I'd hope people would take away from this is that the thread through all of the stuff that we wrote about, the healthcare system, economic inequities, the over-policing of Black and Brown communities, mass incarceration of Black and Brown communities, and more, that the thread through all of this is systemic racism in institutions, as Nick has pointed out. So keeping that in mind, in the last election in 2020, again, while we were writing this, I had lots and lots of conversations with people on social media, many of whom ended up blocking me, which was fine, who said, we got to get back to normal. Well, this book shows you what normal has been like for us. And going back to normal is not enough. It doesn't work. It hasn't worked for us. In fact, we've been used to prop up certain parts of society. And I hope that people take that away, that a return to normal is not a good thing for us, that we need something better.
On that note, on behalf of all, thank you, Keith. I just want to say how proud I am. The audience, I just want to tell you how proud I am of each of these authors. I've known them for a long time. They are so thoughtful, as you can hear, so insightful. And I'm honored to be a part of this project with them. I'm honored. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to the Detroit Public Library for giving us an opportunity to talk about our book, Say Their Names, Why Black Lives Matter in America. And for those out there in the audience who don't get a chance to ask a question, you can email us. We're always available to answer questions. And we're always saying your names in spirit. Thank you for joining us.
I'd like to say thank you to you all for participating. Thank you to the panel. Thanks to our audience. I also want to add, plug for the library. There are copies of Say Their Names available for checkout. If you're interested in purchasing the book, you can purchase copies from the source booksellers. I hope everyone enjoyed the presentation as much as I did. Have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tanika.
Thank
Appreciate you. It was
Hope to
great.
see you soon, Curtis.
Yes.
It was nice seeing all of you.
Nice seeing you too. Thank you, Tanika.
Book.
Thank you.
All right.
I'll hold my copy up too.
Thank you so much.
Great,
Thanks,
great
audience.
plug.
Thanks so much, audience. Appreciate you guys.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks again, everyone. Thanks. Take care.
All right. Bye.
All right.
Bye-bye.